the decision was taken that it is legitimate for farmers to sell cloned meat without actually declaring it that it was cloned. And this is ultimately how organic meat will effectively be removed from the shelves, because what will happen is ultimately the objective is to remove the requirement for labeling. Now, we have to be very, very careful with this observation about removing the requirement for labeling, because food that is grown, in organic farms, in small holdings, you wouldn't expect to be labelled, would you? It's going to be in boxes. It's still going to have the dirt on it. It's natural food.
Right.
The stuff that's sold in the supermarkets, obviously, there is a requirement for it to be labelled. Now, so there's one side of, there's actually a slogan in the US that the campaigners use, which is, effectively, only buy unlabelled food.
Right.
But this is potentially dangerous.
Yeah, of course.
Because the whole objective is ultimately to remove the labelling requirements so that the consumer has absolutely no idea what they're buying.
This is about also a kind of international standardization of food, isn't that right?
Exactly. Codex Alimentarius is global legislation. Codex Alimentarius committees, of which there are 27, all addressing different issues, but these 27 committees are spread out all over the world. And, effectively, what they're establishing is the template for global law. And in 1994, the Codex Alimentarius Commission was very, very close to implementing the type of legislation we're talking about in the US. And they got really right to the 11th hour when there's a chain of stores called Whole Food stores. And Whole Food stores realized what was about to occur, and they picked up the challenge. And Whole Food stores, because it was sort of spread across the US and they had stores in all the major cities, they were able to mobilize their customers, and millions of people hit the streets, and they had millions of people writing to their elected representatives. And of course the elected representatives realized that there was very serious awareness of these issues by the population, and if they didn't do something about it, basically they weren't going to get re-elected.
Yeah.
And so in 1994, a piece of legislation was introduced, which is called the DSHEA legislation, which stands for Dietary Supplement Health Education Act. And it's through this legislation that it effectively put a ring fence around the U.S. food and drug law. But then what happened was the Codex Alimentarius Commission simply turned its attention to Europe. And basically for the past sort of 12 years, it's been working behind the scenes and, using sort of its tentacles throughout the EU to implement this legislation in Europe. And their thinking is that the various countries in Europe don't talk to each other, so they can actually introduce this legislation through the back door. And here we are now. We're literally at the same stage as the US was in 1993, because the game plan is to introduce this legislation with effect from December 31st, 2009. So basically we have 18 months to try and raise the awareness throughout the European Union of what is going on here. Now, it means that we have to address it wholesale, because there's no point in the British people, for example, raising it with their elected members of Parliament, because the British government has completely washed its hands of this legislation, and the British government has basically said, as have most of the other European governments, that they will do whatever it is they're instructed to do by the EU. So this is complete abdication.
Yeah.
So it really is now, in the hands of the population, to try and change this. Otherwise, basically, come 2010, the whole of the food industry and the natural medicines industry will have changed throughout the whole of the EU.
And this is very worrying, considering some of the stuff that is in here in the Codex Alimentarius. And what do you think would happen if this actually comes into effect? What we can see already is a kind of what I at least consider to be an artificially created kind of food crisis, but it's almost like they're preparing us and getting us into the mindset of this already. What's your take on this?
Oh, most definitely. I mean, there's no question. In fact, Gordon Brown, the British Prime Minister, has already given us more than enough evidence that the current food crisis is a deliberate manipulation to create the opportunity for the various governments to present to the people that, the only way out of this is GM crops.
Yeah.
I mean, as I'm sure, your listeners are very aware, everything that's occurring is interconnected.
Yeah.
The current phenomenal and ridiculous manipulation of oil prices is linked directly, to the same issue here as with food.
Yeah.
As is the whole issue of the supposed requirement to be moving towards biofuels. Because in a food shortage, how ridiculous can it be that instead of growing food, we're going to grow crops that can be turned into biofuels?
Yeah.
It's just completely outrageous.
Yeah. Sheesh, my God.
So the whole thing is being engineered to sort of create the perception that the only saviour here is to accept GM crops that can grow, 3 or 4 crops a year.
Mm.
But the real issue here is that the GM crops are completely devoid of the fundamental nutrients, minerals, and vitamins that we need to be healthy.
Mm.
So the reality is that, already our diet is being attacked, by the use of herbicides, of pesticides. I mean, crops that are being developed. I mean, I'm sure some of your listeners will have heard of Roundup Ready crops.
Yeah, we're talking about that.
These are crops that basically don't even germinate unless Roundup, which is a pesticide, is poured on them.
And even I think even the plants themselves are actually referred to as a pesticide or insecticide. They're classified as such. And we know that the animals won't touch it. They won't even bother to eat it, but they're giving it to us humans. No problem.
Well, this is the great irony, Heinrich, that farmers will not feed this stuff to the animals. I mean, you're right, their animals won't touch it, but they won't feed this stuff to the animals, because if they feed this stuff to the animals, guess what? The animals get sick.
Yeah.
And to a farmer, the animals are his livelihood. So, he needs his animals to be in the best possible health. So, there is no question. We are today treating our livestock better than we're treating, our fellow humans. But, there's a very, very important agenda here. Because as people become less healthy because the diet is suffering, and I mean, we won't even get into the area of vaccinations and all that stuff, but there is a pernicious attack on the total well-being of the human being.
Yeah.
And then, of course, who rise to the rescue? Big Pharma.
Yeah.
With a PH. Yeah. So we've got the pharmaceutical companies who in 2002, and I'm using that year because that's the year before the invasion of Iraq, when the oil companies got in on the act. Mm-hmm. But in 2002, the top 10 pharmaceutical companies, the profitability of those companies, those 10 companies, the profitability of those 10 companies was greater than the combined profitability of the other 490 companies in the Fortune 500. So the pharmaceutical industry is a major, major player. I mean, it has been, since the, obviously, Second World War, when I.G. Farben was one of the major supporters of Hitler and his National Socialists.
Right.
And, today, we have a situation where, the big pharmaceutical companies effectively finance whomever it is that they want to put into power. And, of course, whoever it is they put into power is then expected to support their industries.
Yeah.
And I'll give you an example of how those industries are supported. I mean, one classic example is Tamiflu, which is supposedly the antidote to bird flu.
Right.
Although even the documentation of Tamiflu says that all it does is suppress the symptoms for 12 hours. But Tamiflu was developed by a company called Gilead Pharmaceutical. Mm-hmm. And believe it or not, Gilead Pharmaceutical was chaired by Donald Rumsfeld.
There we go.
Now, Donald Rumsfeld, of course, is the guy who was also in the driving seat of Cirque when
Searle.
aspartame was developed.
Yeah,
Pardon me.
Searle, you mean?
Sorry?
Searle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Incredible.
And so Donald Rumsfeld is has a track record here of